So far we have seen that in the Theosophical view there is what we can call the spiritual path, in which we are working on the lines of self-knowledge, self-mastery, purification. And then there is another aspect of this that is sometimes called the occult path, which implies or involves the development of psychic powers and paranormal, let's say, perceptions. But as we have seen, there are two ways of working with that aspect. One is artificial. It's not going to be preserved in future incarnations because it's not actually, these are methods that are quick, but they don't involve the development of the soul itself, which is the one that reincarnates. And then on the other hand, what we have seen is that the development of or extending our abilities and powers is not a good idea until we have walked the spiritual aspect of the path, meaning until we have produced this transformation in which we transcend our confusion, thinking that we are this ego. And then all these other faculties will, on one hand, develop naturally, and on the other hand, there may be some instruction as to how to accelerate that development, but on safe ground, let's say. Again, this is not to demonize the psychic powers. Some people, for whatever reason, perhaps they worked on this in previous lifetimes, or whatever the reason is, they have some psychic powers. In fact, the Theosophical teachings say that we are entering a cycle where people are going to be born with more psychism. And that is all fine and well, but still the position of the Theosophical approach is that our main work should be on this transformation rather than on trying to stimulate more and more these psychic powers. Now, this was a problem that was there at the very beginning of the founding of the Theosophical Society, and Blavatsky wrote an article that is called Practical Occultism. And I'm going to present in these last three classes of this series some excerpts from this article. So she says, there are many people who are looking for practical instruction in occultism. This is the word that she used at the time. Today that word has been abused and applied in ways that were not used during Blavatsky's time. But since she's going to explain this word, we can proceed. So there are many people looking for instructions in practical occultism, and she says it becomes necessary, therefore, to state two things. A, the essential difference between theoretical and practical occultism, or what is generally known as Theosophy on the one hand, and occult science on the other. So she's relating Theosophy to theoretical occultism, not in the sense that Theosophy is just theories, in the sense that when we come to the occult aspect of the spiritual path, the idea is to know about all this, to learn about this. It is important, if you are going to study any science, you spend some time learning the basis for this. You don't go directly into the lab and start blindly mixing up, different substances. So you go through a time where the principles are explained to you, where you get to know the science on a theoretical basis before you are ready to actually begin to work with that. So there is an aspect of Theosophy when it comes to the occult aspect of development, where we can learn about all this theoretically while we are working practically on this spiritual transformation, so that when the time comes, we have that knowledge, because the knowledge that we acquire stays at the level of the soul. So in that incarnation when we may be ready, or it may be necessary for us to be guided to develop certain aspects of this more occult, evolution, so to say, when that time comes, that we already have a knowledge of that. So she says there is an essential difference between Theosophy as this study of the occult aspect, and the occult science itself, which is the practice, the putting into practice all these occult teachings, let's say. So that is one necessary difference that we have to realize. And then the second, the nature of the difficulties that are involved in the study of the latter. I would say, as we will see, what she probably meant is the difficulties in actually beginning to work with the occult science. So then she says, it is easy to become a theosophist. Any person of average intellectual capacities and a leaning toward the metaphysical, of pure and selfish life, who finds more joy in helping his neighbor than in receiving help himself, one who is ever ready to sacrifice his own pleasures for the sake of other people, and who loves truth, goodness, and wisdom for their own sake, not for the benefit they may confer, is a theosophist. So you see, she started saying it's easy to become a theosophist, and we have here a very high ideal. Of course, by theosophist, she wasn't meaning a member of the Theosophical Society. She was using the word theosophist in the essential, the true meaning, which is one that is in touch with the divine wisdom. And it's interesting that she says it is easy to become a theosophist because, as we are going to see in the next slide, it is easy to become a theosophist when compared to what it means to walk the occult path. And then I think this is a very interesting idea that she puts in front of us, a leaning toward the metaphysical. I think the idea there is an interest in trying to understand the world, not just from the concrete perspective, but from the realities that are beyond the physical, of pure and selfish life. So this is part of the work that we do during the spiritual path, as part of the spiritual path, to purify our motivations, to purify our view of life, to become more unselfish, which translates itself in finding more joy in helping others than in receiving help oneself. As we have talked, little by little one begins to be more interested in the general good, and our own good. It's not that we reject it, we escape from it, we deny it. It's just that it's seen in a larger context, so it doesn't seem as important as something that is greater. Then one who is ever ready to sacrifice his own pleasures for the sake of other people, in the same vein of service. And finally, who loves truth, goodness, and wisdom for their own sake, not for the benefit they may confer. And this is a very important point too. The pure spiritual search is not to gain something out of it. One is seeking goodness because it is right to be good, or one seeks wisdom because wisdom is just to understand the truth, or whatever we talk about. It's not because one is expecting more happiness or a mystical experience or a heaven or liberation. There is no real motivation in that sense. There is an attraction for truth and goodness and wisdom by themselves, rather than because they promise to bring something else that we may want. So this marks part of the maturity in the approaching of the spiritual path. So she says, it is easy, or let's say relatively easy, to become a theosophist, but it is quite another matter to put oneself upon the path which leads to the knowledge of what is good to do, as to the right discrimination of good from evil, a path which also leads a person to that power through which he can do the good he desires, often without even apparently lifting a finger. So this is how she's describing the occult path. It's a path which leads to a deeper discrimination, a knowledge of how we can really help. Normally in daily life, we tend to be confused about how to help people. And of course, we have to work from that confusion while we try to develop wisdom, but it is in the experience that we can learn, the experience in trying to help, and also the work on developing a deeper understanding. But the occult path gives us a more unerring perception, so to say, which can give us the view of how we can really help in any given situation. And also it gives us the power, a deeper power, to help in the ways that we see that are fit. And often without even apparently lifting a finger, because that means that we are working from the point of view of meditation. So then she says, moreover, there is one important fact which the student should be made acquainted, namely the enormous, almost limitless responsibility assumed by the teachers for the sake of the pupil. From the moment they begin really to teach, from the instant they confer any power on their pupils, they take upon themselves all the sins of that pupil in connection with the occult sciences, whether of omission, commission, until the moment when initiation makes the pupil a master responsible in his turn. So this is something that has to do with how the law of karma works. Whenever somebody teaches somebody else to develop certain powers, then in the process of learning how to use those powers, and in the process of becoming an adult, so to say, what Blavatsky says here, becoming a master himself, an adult in the occult realm, let's say, during that time, whoever is teaching the disciple to develop these powers takes on the karma of how the disciple uses the powers. For this reason, there is a very strict process of selection and trials and probation for people who are going to become disciples, because they are giving this person certain powers that that person otherwise would not have at that time. And if the person uses it in the wrong way, then the responsibility falls on the master. So for this reason also, the masters are very careful about teaching things that can be potentially dangerous, or teaching things to people who have not first reduced the possibility of misusing these powers as much as possible, basically by transcending the attachment to one's desires and personality, etc., etc. And this is also part of why all these abilities and powers are not freely given. Not only that it would be bad for the world if people had the power to do evil, but also it's bad for whoever is facilitating that acquisition. But then Blavatsky comes back to the idea of what occultism really is, because all these powers and all of that are just secondary tools. This is not what occultism is. So she says, occultism is not magic. It is comparatively easy to learn the tricks of spells and the methods of using the subtler but still material forces of physical nature. So all the forces that are behind the physical nature that we see, this is what is called elementals, for example, in Theosophy. We can learn how to manipulate them and how to produce effects on the physical plane. But these are all material forces. This is, as we said at the beginning of this series, this is not spiritual per se. It's just an extension of the physical. We can call it psychic, but it's still material. And as she says these psychic powers of the animal soul, and this is how she used to call the psychic aspect in ourselves, are soon awakened. The forces which love, hate, passion can call into operation are readily developed. So all this psychism is easy enough to develop. However, she says this is sorcery, for it is the motive and the motive alone which makes any exercise of power become malignant or beneficent magic. So there are ways to develop psychic powers which are relatively easy compared to the transformation, the spiritual transformation, which may take several incarnations. The development of powers, when we know the method, may take a few months. So there is relatively easy to develop these powers, but then whether the use of those powers become black magic or divine magic, as Blavatsky calls them, will depend on the motivation. Are we motivated by our desires, by our hurt, by our fear? Then all that is black magic. She says it is impossible to employ spiritual forces if there is the slightest tinge of selfishness remaining in the operator. For unless the intention is entirely unalloyed, the spiritual will transform itself into the psychic, act on the astral plane, and dire results may be produced by it. So unless there is a completely unselfish, impersonal, compassionate, loving intention, then all those forces that we start moving will get tainted and will be turned into astral forces instead of spiritual forces, let's say. She says the powers and forces of the animal nature can equally be used by the selfish and revengeful as by the unselfish and the all-forgiving. The powers and forces of the spirit lend themselves only to the perfectly pure in heart, and this is divine magic. So this is why there is so much emphasis in the Theosophical tradition to work first on the transformation, and then the person may be ready to enter into the occult path.